It all started on a bright summer morning when I decided to finally take my boat out onto the lake that had been in my family for generations. A lake that was not just water to me, but a piece of my heritage, my memories, my sweat, and my pride. Yet as soon as I backed my trailer down the ramp and launched into the calm water, I heard the unmistakable voice of a Karen echoing across the shore, demanding to know what I thought I was doing and warning me that I was in violation of HOA rules. And before I could even answer her, she was already dialing 911 to report me for trespassing on my own land. And that's when I realized this was going to be one of those days where you fight not just for your rights, but for your dignity. So before I take you deeper into this unbelievable story, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Sham Stories so you never miss the wildest HOA battles you'll ever hear, because what happened next will leave your jaw on the floor as much as it left mine. For when the cops showed up less than 10 minutes later, everything changed, but not the way the HOA expected. The officer stepped out of his car with a look of authority, his sunglasses reflecting the sunlight off the water as Karen ran up to him, ranting about how I had broken community rules, how the lake was private and owned by the HOA, how I was a danger to the peace, and how she, as an HOA board member, demanded immediate arrest. But when the officer turned to me and asked for my side, I simply pulled out the thick folder of documents I always carried when dealing with these busybodies. A folder that held not only the original deeds showing that the lake and surrounding shoreline were entirely in my name, but also the maps, the legal descriptions, and even the signed statements from county officials verifying the same. And when I calmly handed them over, the officer flipped through them with raised brows, while Karen's mouth flapped like a fish pulled out of water, sputtering about how I must have faked them or misunderstood the rules. And the officer, tired of her interruptions, finally asked her if she had any documents to prove her claim. At which point she stammered and insisted that everyone knows the HOA controls the lake. But the officer shook his head and said that wasn't how law worked, that property deeds mattered, and that if she had a problem, she could take it to court. But as of now, I had every legal right to launch my boat, fish, swim, or do anything else on my property. The crowd that had gathered, neighbors who loved drama and the HOA board members who had been called in by Karen, murmured it angrily. But I noticed a few smirks too, because not everyone agreed with the OSI-infested control. And the officer finally told Karen to stand down, warning her that making false reports to the police could land her in real legal trouble. Then, with a nod to me, he left, leaving Karen fuming and the board members whispering furiously among themselves. And I should have felt relief, but instead I felt something else. Something colder, because I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And that's when I decided if they wanted a war over this lake, I was going to give them one they'd never forget. Over the next few days, the HOA doubled down, sending me threatening letters claiming that they would fine me thousands of dollars for violating community bylaws, attaching pictures of my boat tied to my own dock as if it were evidence of a crime, and even suggesting that they would place liens on my property if I didn't comply. But what they didn't realize was that I wasn't just some naive homeowner who didn't know his rights. I was someone who had built businesses, negotiated contracts, and understood both real estate and law better than any of them. So, I drafted my own letters, polite but firm, attaching copies of the same deeds and warning them that any further harassment would result in legal action against them personally, as well as the HOA as an entity. Still, Karen wasn't satisfied, and one evening, I saw her walking around the lakefront with a tape measure, scribbling notes in a little book as if she were preparing to build a case against me, muttering loudly enough for me to hear that we'll see how long you keep that boat here once the board votes. And that's when I started digging deeper into their so-called ownership of the Marina they claimed to control, a small collection of docks and slips on one side of the lake that they rented out to residents at ridiculous prices, always favoring their friends while shunning anyone who dared to question them. It didn't take long to uncover that the Marina, though used by the HOA, wasn't actually owned by them at all. It was leased from the county, and the lease was expiring soon, with no guarantee of renewal. And that little discovery lit a fire in me because suddenly the idea of not just defending my rights, but taking the fight to them became very real. And I began to hatch a plan that would change everything about the balance of power around this lake. In the meantime, Karen escalated her harassment, posting on the neighborhood social media groups about how I was dangerous, how I didn't care about community harmony, and how I was destroying the beauty of the lake by daring to keep my boat there. And while some of her allies cheered her on, others began to ask questions, pointing out that the lake was clearly private property and that maybe, just maybe, the HOA had overstepped its bounds. And those cracks in their wall of control gave me just enough room to wedge in my next move. I called a meeting with the county official in charge of the Marina lease, bringing along my lawyer and every document I had about the history of the lake and the surrounding land. And when we laid everything out on the table, the official leaned back, rubbed his chin, and admitted that there had been oversight for years. That technically, the marina sat on a parcel of land that was supposed to revert to the adjacent property owner if the lease ever expired. And guess who that adjacent property owner was? Me. My lawyer smiled like a cat who had cornered a mouse, and the official, eager to avoid any legal disputes, quietly agreed to let the lease lapse and transfer ownership to me once the paperwork was finalized. Walking out of that meeting, I felt an energy surge through me like nothing I had felt before, because I wasn't just standing up to the HOA anymore. I was about to own the very marina they lorded over as their greatest prize, and though it would take a few weeks for the process to complete, I could already imagine the look on Karen's face when she realized the empire she had built on lies and intimidation was about to crumble. The following weeks moved slowly, yet every day carried with it a quiet anticipation that made the air almost hum with energy because I knew the paperwork transferring. Ownership of the marina was inching closer to completion, and while I waited, I couldn't help but notice the HOA intensifying their efforts to break me. Almost as though Karen sensed that her time as queen of the lake was slipping away, and she wasn't about to let go without a fight. Letters kept arriving in my mailbox, each one stamped with the HOA logo, demanding payment for fabricated fines, citing obscure bylaw numbers they probably pulled out of thin air, and threatening everything from property liens to lawsuits if I didn't remove my boat immediately. But every time I received one, I felt more amusement than fear, because I knew the clock was ticking on their supposed power, and soon I'd hold the deed to their pride and joy. Still, harassment was one thing, but direct confrontation was another. And one Saturday morning, while I was polishing my boat on the dock, Karen marched down the path flanked by two of her bored allies, arms crossed, sunglasses perched on her nose like she was the sheriff of some imagined Wild West, and without so much as a greeting, she launched into a tirade about how I had embarrassed her in front of the police, how she wasn't going to tolerate rogue behavior undermining the HOA, and how if I didn't voluntarily comply, they would drag me through court until I couldn't afford to keep the property anymore. I listened calmly, letting her spew her venom while I methodically polished the bow. And when she finally paused for breath, I looked her in the eye and said, "Karen, if you think you know the law better than the county, be my guest. But I think you're going to be very unhappy when you find out who's really in charge of this lake," she scoffed. Her friends snickered, and they stormed off muttering about how delusional I was. But what they didn't know was that within days I'd have the paperwork in my hands, and their entire facade of control would collapse. During that time, I began noticing subtle changes in the neighborhood mood because word of my confrontation with the police and my defiance of the HOA had spread quickly. And while Karen tried to spin the narrative that I was a troublemaker, there were whispers among the residents that perhaps I was simply standing up for my rights in a way others had been too afraid to. And little by little, people began stopping by my dock to chat. One neighbor admitted he hated paying the outrageous fees for a slip at the marina, but did it out of fear of retaliation. Another told me Karen once threatened to fine him for planting a tree without approval, and another said she was tired of the board using community funds like their personal piggy bank. Each conversation reinforced what I already suspected, that the HOA's reign was built on fear, not genuine respect, and the moment that fear broke, their control would shatter like glass. My lawyer kept me updated almost daily, reassuring me that the transfer was proceeding smoothly. and one afternoon he called to say the county had officially signed the documents, meaning that within a few business days, I would have full ownership of the marina, docks, and adjoining land. And when I hung up the phone, I couldn't help but let out a laugh that startled even me, because the tables had turned so completely that Karen wouldn't even know what hit her. But of course, fate has a way of making victories messy, and Karen wasn't one to go quietly. When she somehow caught wind of the transfer, most likely from one of her spies at the county office, she went on the offensive like a cornered animal, rallying the board for emergency meetings, posting inflammatory messages in the neighborhood forum about how I was stealing community, property, and even hiring a lawyer of her own to send me Sisandis' letter claiming that the HOA had rights to the marina. I received the letter in the mail, scanned it quickly, and almost burst out laughing because it was filled with half-baked arguments and vague threats with no real legal teeth. But I decided to respond anyway through my lawyer, who drafted a professional yet scathing rebuttal that dismantled every point of their claim and warned that continued harassment could open them up to liability for damages and defamation. Karen must have been furious when she read it, because the very next day, she and a small group of loyalists showed up at the marina with clipboards, strutting around like they owned the place, taking photos, shouting orders at boat owners, and telling everyone that I was lying and that the HOA was still in charge. I stood on the dock watching the scene unfold, my heart pounding with both anger and excitement. And finally, when they confronted me directly, I told them point blank that within days the deed would be in my possession and that their little charade was about to end. Karen turned red, sputtering about how she'd never let that happen. But her words rang hollow even as she spoke them, because I could see the doubt flicker in the eyes of the very people she counted on for support. When the deed finally arrived, delivered by certified mail in a thick envelope, I opened at my kitchen table. I felt a wave of triumph so strong it nearly knocked me back in my chair. There it was in black and white, my name as the legal owner of the marina and surrounding property. I sat there for a moment just staring at it, letting the weight of it sink in, realizing that in one stroke I had not only defended my rights, but taken away the HOA's crown jewel, their primary source of revenue and their greatest leverage over the community. The next step was to make it official. So I headed to the marina the following morning, documents in hand, and pinned a laminated notice to the bulletin board declaring that, as of now, the marina was under new ownership and that all rental agreements would be suspended pending review. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Some residents cheered quietly, finally free of the ridiculous fees the HOA imposed, while others were confused or nervous, unsure what this meant for their boats and slips. Karen, however, nearly had a meltdown right there on the dock, screaming about how I was a fraud, how she would sue me personally, and how the entire neighborhood would rally behind her to take me down. But her tantrum only seemed to push people further away. I noticed more than a few neighbors rolling their eyes or shaking their heads as she ranted. That night, I received dozens of emails and messages from residents, some supportive, some angry, and some simply asking what came next. I knew this was my chance to shift the narrative completely, so I drafted a calm, clear message explaining that the marina was now privately owned, that I intended to run it fairly and transparently, and that fees would be dramatically reduced to cover only maintenance and necessary expenses rather than padding HOA coffers. I emphasized that no one would be denied a slip for political reasons or personal grudges, a jab at Karen's history of favoritism, and I invited anyone with concerns to speak with me directly. The next morning, responses poured in, overwhelmingly positive, with people thanking me for finally standing up to the HOA for the first time. I felt the tide turning, not just legally, but socially, and I knew Karen's grip on the neighborhood was slipping fast. Still, I wasn't naive enough to think she would stop fighting, and I braced myself for whatever desperate stunt she might pull next. Because Karen wasn't just angry, she was terrified, and desperate people always make mistakes. The storm truly began after my announcement went out, because though the majority of residents responded with cautious optimism, Karen and her loyal inner circle launched what could only be described as a smear campaign of desperation, plastering the neighborhood with flyers claiming that I was a conman, that I had bribed county officials to steal the marina, and that I was going to raise prices so high that no one would be able to afford a slip. And while the lies were laughable, the sheer aggression of her tactics stirred up enough anxiety that several neighbors stopped me on the street to ask if any of it was true. So I took the time to reassure them, showing them the deed whenever necessary, walking them through my plans for fair management, and reminding them that for the first time in years, they actually had a choice in how things were run. This one-on-one engagement worked far better than I could have imagined because people were used to the HOA board operating from behind closed doors, issuing dictates without explanation. And here I was, standing openly, transparent, and approachable, which made Karen's hysterical claims look even more absurd by comparison. Still, I knew she wasn't done because she thrived on confrontation. And sure enough, a week later, she called for a special HOA meeting at the community center, plastering the invitation on every mailbox and claiming the future of the neighborhood depended on attendance. I decided to go, not because I respected her authority, but because I wanted to face whatever storm she was brewing head on. And when I walked into the room that evening, the tension was palpable, with folding chairs filled wall to wall, residents whispering and casting glances between me and the front podium where Karen stood, clutching a thick binder like it was a weapon. She opened the meeting with a long-winded tirade about tradition, community values, and the so-called dangers of letting outsiders seize control of what had always been under the HOA's management. And though she never mentioned me by name, every pointed jab about selfish individuals and rogue actors made her target obvious. When she finally paused for dramatic effect, I raised my hand and asked for the floor. The room fell silent as all eyes turned toward me. I walked to the podium, holding my copy of the deed high, and spoke clearly so there could be no misunderstanding. I am not an outsider. This lake has been in my family for generations. The Marina is legally mine, and no amount of shouting, lying, or fear-mongering will change that. What will change, however, is how this community is treated, because starting now, people will have a fair chance to enjoy this lake without being bullied or gouged. The reaction was immediate and divided. Half the room erupted in applause. The other half muttered angrily, but the critical detail I noticed was that Karen's grip was slipping. Her loyalists fewer than she expected, and her face turned crimson as she realized the applause was drowning out her voice. Of course, Karen being Karen, she didn't back down gracefully, but instead doubled down on her threats, declaring that the HOA would sue me in civil court for damages and that my ownership would never stand under scrutiny. Yet even as she spoke, I could see doubt flickering in her eyes, as though some part of her knew she was bluffing on thin ice. I left the meeting that night both exhilarated and wary, because while I had gained ground, I also knew Karen would do everything in her power to sabotage me before accepting defeat. True to form, the sabotage began almost immediately. Anonymous complaints were suddenly filed with the county about supposed safety violations at the Marina loose boards on the docks, improperly stored fuel, even accusations of environmental hazards. But each time inspectors arrived, they found everything in order, and after a while one of them quietly told me it was clear I was being targeted. I thanked him, and though the constant harassment was exhausting, it also gave me more evidence of the HOA's bad faith, which I carefully documented, knowing it might prove useful later. Meanwhile, residents began to experience what can only be described as an awakening. For years, they had accepted Karen's bullying as the cost of living near the lake. But now that someone had stood up and fought back, they began to question everything. Why were HOA dues so high? Where exactly was the money going? And why did a handful of board members make decisions that affected everyone else without transparency? Several neighbors quietly approached me with documents of their own, records they had kept of questionable HOA expenses, lavish retreats supposedly for board business, landscaping contracts awarded to companies owned by relatives, and unexplained withdrawals from the community account. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became that Karen and her cronies had been running the HOA, less like a governing body and more like a personal slush fund. And when I shared these findings with a few trusted residents, word spread like wildfire. Suddenly, it wasn't just me versus Karen, it was a growing movement of neighbors demanding accountability. And the board found itself cornered. Karen tried to counter this rising tide by escalating her smear campaign, accusing me online of hacking HOA emails, vandalizing property, and even intimidating residents, none of which had a shred of truth. And while some people initially panicked, the majority saw through her increasingly wild accusations, especially when I remained calm and refused to sink to her level. Instead, I focused on improvements at the Marina, repairing aging docks, lowering slip fees, and even organizing a small barbecue for residents to enjoy by the water. That event turned out to be a turning point because it was the first time in years people had gathered at the Marina without the heavy hand of the HOA dictating who could and couldn't be there. And the laughter, music, and sense of freedom spoke louder than any speech I could give. Karen, of course, showed up, standing on the sidelines with her arms crossed, scowling like the party itself was a personal attack. But her sour presence only underscored how much joy she had stolen from people over the years. By the end of that night, several neighbors openly talked about organizing a recall of the board, a process buried in the HOA bylaws that no one had dared attempt before. But with the evidence of mismanagement piling up and the community's patience wearing thin, momentum was building toward real change. I didn't push too hard, wanted the movement to feel organic rather than me pulling the strings, but I quietly supported those who took the lead, sharing documents when asked and encouraging them to stand firm against Karen's inevitable intimidation. And intimidate she did, phone calls in the middle of the night, threatening letters slipped under doors, even shouting matches in the street. But instead of cowing people into silence, her behavior only fueled their determination. The climax of this chapter came when Karen, in one last desperate move, tried to stage a confrontation at the Marina during a busy Saturday afternoon. She marched down the dock with her entourage. Waving a stack of papers she claimed proved the HOA's ownership, and began ordering boaters to leave immediately. But this time, instead of quietly obeying, the residents stood their ground. One by one, they refused to move, some even shouting back at her, demanding she show real evidence instead of waving meaningless printouts. I stepped forward, holding up the actual deed, and announced loud enough for everyone to hear that I was the legal owner, and if she continued her harassment, I would have no choice but to file charges for defamation and interference. The crowd erupted in cheers. Karen's papers fluttered uselessly in the breeze, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. Not the fear of losing an argument, but the fear of losing everything she had built on lies. She turned on her heel and stormed off, her followers scattering behind her, leaving the dock buzzing with excitement and relief. That night, as I sat on my porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized that while the battle was far from over, the tide had decisively turned. The community was no longer blindly following Karen. They were waking up, finding their voices, and beginning to imagine a neighborhood free from her tyranny. For me, the victory wasn't just about owning the Marina anymore. It was about restoring dignity and freedom to a place that had been suffocated for too long. And I knew the next moves Karen made would either seal her fate or drag her down even further. What I didn't know was just how far she was willing to go, and how her desperation would soon push her into dangerous territory. In the weeks that followed her public humiliation at the Marina, Karen's desperation metastasized into recklessness. And though most people assumed she would eventually tire herself out and accept defeat, I knew better, because people like her never surrendered. They escalated. And sure enough, the escalation came in the form of legal papers delivered to my doorstep one gray morning, announcing that the HOA was suing me for trespassing, unlawful seizure of property, and damages exceeding $500,000. A laughable claim given the ironclad deed in my possession, but one that forced me to hire an attorney nonetheless, because ignoring it would have been a mistake. So I met with a local lawyer named David, a steady man with a sharp mind, who, after reading the documents, chuckled dryly and said, "This is pure intimidation. It won't hold up in court, but they're hoping to drain you financially or scare you into backing off," which only confirmed what I already suspected. Karen's strategy had shifted from bullying to legal warfare. And though I was ready for the fight, I couldn't help but feel a knot of anger in my chest at how far she was willing to go to cling to power. Meanwhile, Her antics outside the courtroom grew even more outrageous. She patrolled the neighborhood in her golf cart like a self-appointed sheriff, stopping by the Marina daily to snap photos of boaters, shouting about evidence she was gathering for her lawsuit, and even trying to block access to the main gate with traffic cones until residents angrily moved them aside. Her actions were so erratic that whispers began circulating that maybe she wasn't just power-hungry, but truly unhinged. And for the first time, even some of her staunchest allies began to distance themselves, uncomfortable with being tethered to her spiral. The breaking point for many came one Saturday morning when Karen staged what she probably thought would be a masterstroke, but instead turned into a disaster for her. She showed up with a hired security team, 3 men in ill-fitting uniforms who looked like they had been plucked off a strip mall parking lot, tried to blockade the Marina entrance, telling arriving boaters that per HOA rules, they were no longer permitted to launch their vessels. What she hadn't accounted for was that people were fed up and emboldened. And instead of turning around quietly as they might have months ago, they called the sheriff. Within 20 minutes, deputies arrived, listened to both sides, and promptly ordered Karen and her hired guards to leave the premises, reminding her that she had no legal authority there whatsoever. The deputies even apologized to me, explaining they had received dozens of similar calls about her in recent weeks. And it was becoming clear she was abusing the system. Word of that incident spread like wildfire. By the end of the day, half the neighborhood knew that Karen had been escorted off the Marina property by law enforcement. An image so damaging to her reputation that no amount of spin could repair it. Still, in her mind, she hadn't lost. She had simply been misunderstood, and she continued, ranting on the HOA's social media page about how corrupt the sheriff's department was and how justice would soon be served in court. As all this unfolded, the community's momentum toward independence only grew stronger. Residents organized their own meetings, not sanctioned by the HOA but open to all, where they discussed a recall vote to remove the board entirely. And though I wasn't leading those efforts, I was invited to speak at one, where I emphasized the importance of unity and reminded them that the power ultimately lay with the people if they stood together. The applause that night was thunderous, and it struck me how deeply people had longed for someone to validate what they already knew, that they didn't need to be ruled by fear. Karen must have heard about the meeting because the very next day, new flyers appeared, claiming the recall effort was illegal and that anyone participating could be fined. But by then, no one cared. In fact, her threats seemed only to fuel the movement, as residents began openly discussing her misuse of HOA funds, her abusive behavior, and the need for a completely fresh start. I watched it unfold with a mix of pride and caution, knowing that while the tide had turned, a wounded animal was at its most dangerous. And Karen was nothing if not a wounded animal. The lawsuit crawled forward, and though David assured me it was flimsy, it still required time, paperwork, and court appearances, each of which Karen used as a Stage 2 grandstand. At one hearing, she stood before the judge and accused me of orchestrating a hostile takeover of community property, complete with a wild narrative about bribing county officials and intimidating residents with threats of violence, claims so outrageous that the judge cut her off and asked if she had any actual evidence. She stammered, shuffled her papers, and ultimately admitted she did not, which the judge noted in the record. But she still spun it afterward as though she had exposed corruption, ranting to anyone who would listen about how the system was stacked against her. The truth was, the case was collapsing, and she knew it. But instead of conceding, she lashed out harder, filing frivolous complaints not just against me, but against residents she suspected of supporting me, accusing them of violating obscure HOA rules or failing to maintain their properties to standard. It was a last-ditch attempt to reassert dominance. But by then, her power was an illusion, and people began ignoring her letters, tossing them straight into the trash. The real shift came when financial records of the HOA were finally pried open, thanks to a small group of residents who demanded transparency and, after weeks of stonewalling, threatened to involve the state attorney general's office. What those records revealed was worse than anyone expected: tens of thousands of dollars unaccounted for, contracts awarded to companies tied to Karen's family members, and evidence of dues being funneled into personal expenses like spa trips, designer furniture, and vacations. When this information hit the community, it was like a bomb going off. Neighbors who had defended her suddenly went silent. Others who had stayed neutral turned furious, and the recall effort gained unstoppable momentum. Karen tried to dismiss it all as misinterpretation, but the numbers didn't lie. And the outrage was so widespread that even members of her own board began resigning quietly, leaving her increasingly isolated. Through it all, I kept my focus on building, not tearing down. At the Marina, we continued improvements, adding lighting for safety, offering discounted slip rentals to longtime residents, and even organizing a small regatta for families to participate in. The sight of kids laughing on paddleboards, parents grilling by the shore, and the community coming together without fear reminded everyone what was at stake, not just property or money, but a way of life. The Marina had become a symbol of freedom, and in many ways it exposed the HOA for what it had become under Karen Cage. The contrast was undeniable, and as more people experienced the joy of the lake without her interference, the more determined they became to finally break free of her control once and for all. Still, Karen's final descent into desperation was both spectacular and disturbing. Late one night, she trespassed onto the Marina property with a few of her remaining loyalists and tried to chain the gate shut, claiming she was repossessing it on behalf of the HOA. Unfortunately for her, several residents witnessed the act and called the sheriff, who arrived quickly, cut the chains, and escorted Karen and her cohorts off the property under threat of arrest. The deputies warned her that next time, charges would be filed. And though she shouted about conspiracies and corruption as she was led away, the image of her being physically removed was seared into everyone's memory. For many, it was the final straw, proof that she wasn't just power-hungry, but dangerous. And the recall petition gathered signatures at lightning speed. Within a week, it surpassed the threshold required, and a date for the recall vote was set. The lead-up to that vote felt like the climax of a long, bitter war. Karen campaigned furiously, knocking on doors, leaving voicemails, and even crying in front of people about how she was being betrayed, but her efforts fell flat. People had seen too much, endured too much, and lost too much under her rule to be swayed by crocodile tears. When the day of the vote finally arrived, turnout was massive, with residents lining up at the community center to cast their ballots, and as the evening wore on, the results became clear. Karen and her board were overwhelmingly removed, replaced by a temporary committee tasked with rebuilding the HOA from the ground up. When the announcement was made, the cheers echoed across the neighborhood. Fireworks went off by the lake, and for the first time in years, the community felt truly free. I stood at the edge of the marina that night, watching the reflections of fireworks ripple across the water, and thought about how far we had come. From Karen calling the cops on me for launching my own boat to this moment of liberation, and though I knew the battle had taken its toll, I also knew it had been worth every second. What I didn't realize then was that Karen wasn't finished. Not entirely because people like her rarely vanish quietly, and in her bitterness and humiliation. She would soon make one final move that would test everything we had built. The recall should have been the end of it, the curtain falling on Karen's long reign of intimidation and control. But instead it only seemed to ignite something darker inside her, because rather than retreating into obscurity like many expected, she became more volatile and unpredictable, lashing out in ways that went beyond politics or neighborhood squabbles and bordered on outright sabotage. And it began just days after the recall, when several boats moored at the marina mysteriously had their lines cut, sending them drifting into the lake where they were damaged against the rocks. A cruel act that residents immediately suspected Karen of orchestrating, even though no one caught her in the act. The sheriff's deputies opened an investigation, and while they couldn't pin it on her directly, they did discover footprints in the mud leading from the marina gate to a trail that ran behind Karen's property. Circumstantial evidence that made her look guiltier than ever, though she predictably claimed she was being framed. Still, the damage was done, not just to the boats, but to any lingering reputation she clung to, because residents were horrified that someone would endanger their property and safety out of spite. And whispers spread quickly that Karen wasn't just bitter, but dangerous. and perhaps even unstable. Meanwhile, I found myself more determined than ever not to let her antics derail the progress we had made. So I organized volunteers to repair the docks, replace the cut lines, and increase security at the marina with cameras and better locks. A move that reassured residents and sent a clear message: we weren't going to be intimidated anymore. But Karen's desperation didn't stop at sabotage. She began filing endless reports with county offices, claiming environmental violations at the marina, alleging that my boat launch was contaminating the water, that new lighting installations harmed local wildlife, and even that gatherings at the marina were creating unsafe noise levels. Inspectors came out repeatedly, often apologizing for wasting my time, because each time they found nothing amiss. But Karen's barrage of complaints was clearly designed to exhaust me, to drown me in bureaucracy until I gave up. Instead, her efforts backfired spectacularly, because each time an inspector signed off with a clean report, it strengthened my standing and credibility in the community while exposing her pettiness. Neighbors began rallying around me even more, offering to volunteer at the marina, writing letters of support, and in some cases outright confronting Karen when she passed by in her golf cart, demanding she leave everyone alone. For someone who once thrived on fear, she was now living in isolation, her empire crumbling around her, and yet she still refused to let go, clinging to whatever scraps of attention she could stir up. The breaking point came when she attempted one final spectacle, perhaps believing it would restore her lost dominance, though in reality it only sealed her fate. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon when I organized a community barbecue by the lake to celebrate the recall victory and the improvements at the marina. An event meant to bring people together in laughter and music after months of tension. Families gathered with picnic baskets, kids splashed in the shallows, and the air smelled of grilled burgers and sunscreen. But just as the mood reached its peak, Karen appeared, marching down the dock with a bullhorn in one hand and a stack of papers in the other, shouting about how the event was illegal and that everyone present was trespassing on HOA property. The absurdity of her words was only matched by the spectacle of her, screaming into the bullhorn while children stared, wide-eyed, and parents muttered in disbelief. And when she started waving her papers, declaring them as legal injunctions, I calmly stepped forward and asked to see them. What she handed me was nothing more than a rambling manifesto she had typed up herself, filled with threats, pseudo-legal jargon, and bizarre claims about how she was still the rightful leader of the HOA. A document so ridiculous that laughter rippled through the crowd as I read it aloud. Enraged by the laughter, Karen tried to seize the grill, shouting that she was shutting this down, but before she could cause further chaos, deputies who had been invited as guests intervened, gently taking the bullhorn from her hands and escorting her away while she shrieked about conspiracies. The scene was both sad and surreal, and as the community watched her being led up the hill, many shook their heads, realizing that Karen had truly lost touch with reality. In the aftermath of that spectacle, the community's resolve hardened like steel. Residents who had once avoided conflict now openly denounced Karen, signing a petition to bar her from the marina permanently and requesting a restraining order to prevent her from harassing the neighborhood. The sheriff's office, tired of her constant antics, finally issued her a formal warning that if she continued her behavior, criminal charges would follow. The new interim HOA committee distanced itself entirely from her, releasing a statement condemning her actions and pledging to rebuild the organization with transparency and fairness. For the first time in a long while, there was real hope in the air, a belief that the neighborhood could heal and thrive without fear of retaliation. As for me, I felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion, knowing the war was nearing its end, but also aware that Karen's shadow still loomed. And though she was weakened, she wasn't gone. It was around this time that an unexpected opportunity presented itself, one that would not only cement my role in the community, but also ensure that the lake and marina remained protected from power-hungry individuals forever. A developer approached me with an offer to purchase part of the marina land for a luxury project, dangling a tempting sum that could have set me up comfortably for life. But I declined immediately, recognizing the danger of letting outside interests take root. Instead, I proposed a different path: creating a non-profit trust to manage the marina. With residents as stakeholders and all decisions made transparently, ensuring that no one person or group could ever seize control for selfish purposes again, the idea resonated deeply, and soon volunteers stepped forward to help form the trust, draft bylaws, and set up a system where every voice mattered. It was the antithesis of Karen's regime where, once she ruled through secrecy and fear. We now built a future on openness and trust. The more we worked on it, the stronger the community bond became. Of course, Karen tried to sabotage even this. She filed an objection with the county clerk, claiming the trust was illegitimate, and even went so far as to show up uninvited at one of our organizational meetings, shouting about how we were brainwashing the neighborhood. This time, however, no one tolerated it. She was quickly asked to leave, and when she refused, deputies escorted her out once again, this time citing her for disorderly conduct. The citation may have seemed minor, but symbolically it was massive, Karen. The self-proclaimed enforcer of rules was now the one being fined for breaking them. For many, it was the final confirmation that her era of dominance was truly over. Yet even as she faded into irrelevance, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. Part of me relished the victory, the poetic justice of watching her empire crumble. But another part of me felt pity, recognizing that beneath all the bluster and cruelty was a woman so consumed by power that she had lost everything: her friends, her respect, her credibility, and ultimately her place in the community. That night, as I walked the quiet docks of the marina, the water reflecting the moonlight in ripples of silver, I thought about how far we had come since that first day when she called the cops on me for launching my boat. And I realized the journey had never been just about me or even about Karen. It had been about a community reclaiming its dignity. And in that moment, I knew we were stronger than we had ever been. Still, I also knew that every story has one final chapter. And Karen's wasn't finished yet, because in the weeks to come, she would launch her most desperate scheme yet. One so reckless and audacious that it would test not just me but the entire neighborhood, and force us to stand together one last time. Everyone believed Karen was finished after the recall, the citation, and the public humiliation at the barbecue. But we underestimated just how deep her need for control went. Because instead of retreating into obscurity, she began planning what would become her most reckless and dangerous move yet. One that unfolded slowly at first, but soon threatened everything we had fought to build. It started with whispers that she was recruiting a small group of loyalists, the last remnants of her crumbling power base, by convincing them that the Marina Trust and community changes were part of a grand conspiracy to seize private property. And though most people dismissed her as delusional, a handful of residents, bitter about losing their own perks under her regime, began meeting with her in secret. Reports trickled back to me from neighbors who had seen Karen hosting gatherings at her home late into the night. Cars lined along the street while she spoke passionately inside. And though I had no concrete evidence, I suspected she was plotting something disruptive. My suspicions proved right one morning when I arrived at the marina to find spray-painted slogans across the dock. Not yours. HOA forever, thieves graffiti, scrawled in thick black letters that clearly bore the mark of desperation. We cleaned it quickly, but the message was clear. Karen hadn't given up. She had simply shifted her battle from public spectacle to guerrilla-style disruption, a strategy that was harder to anticipate and more draining to combat. The situation escalated when the trust filed official paperwork with the county, formalizing its management of the marina and surrounding land, a milestone we celebrated with quiet satisfaction, believing it marked the final nail in the coffin of Karen's influence. But 2 days later, we woke to chaos. Someone had cut the power to the marina, plunging the docks into darkness and damaging the refrigeration systems in several boats, resulting in thousands of dollars in losses. Once again, footprints in the mud traced back toward Karen's property. But no one had seen her directly, and she vehemently denied involvement when deputies came knocking. Yet even in her denial, there was something unhinged in her eyes, a wild defiance that sent a chill down my spine. Because it wasn't just about winning anymore, it was about destruction. About making sure that if she couldn't have control, No one else could either. The community, though shaken, rallied quickly, repairing the damage, installing backup generators, and vowing not to let her intimidation tactics succeed. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. People began to worry not just about property damage, but about safety. More than one resident asked me privately if Karen might escalate to violence. The true climax of her desperation came on a sweltering Saturday afternoon when Karen and her loyalists staged what they clearly believed would be a triumphant reclamation, without warning. They marched down to the Marina, carrying homemade banners, chanting slogans about taking back our lake, and armed with padlocks and chains. They attempted to block the docks while shouting that they were reinstating the HOA's authority. At first, stunned families and boaters backed away, unsure of what was happening. But soon the shouting turned into shoving, and the situation threatened to spiral into a full-blown riot. I rushed to the scene, heart pounding, and confronted Karen directly, demanding she'd leave before things got out of hand. Her face was flushed, her eyes blazing with manic energy. And she screamed back that I had stolen everything from her, that I had brainwashed the community, and that she would rather see the lake burn than let me keep it. Her words, unhinged as they were, carried a terrifying sincerity. I realized in that moment that she wasn't bluffing. She was ready to destroy it all out of spite. Before the situation could escalate further, deputies arrived in force. Having been called by frightened residents, this time they didn't come with warnings or gentle escorts, they came with handcuffs. Karen resisted, thrashing and shouting as deputies restrained her, screaming accusations of corruption and betrayal, but the crowd that gathered around didn't cheer or mock her as they had in the past. Instead, there was a heavy silence, a shared recognition that this had gone beyond neighborhood drama and into dangerous territory. Several of her loyalists were detained as well. The deputies assured us charges would finally be filed: criminal mischief, trespassing, and resisting arrest charges that carried real consequences. Watching her being led away in handcuffs, I felt a complicated mix of relief and sadness, because while she had brought this on herself, it was also the tragic end of a person consumed by obsession. In the days that followed, the community reeled from the chaos, but also found new strength. With Karen physically removed from the picture, there was a sense of breathing room, a chance to rebuild without constant sabotage. And residents poured their energy into the trust with renewed determination. Volunteers repaired the docks yet again, cameras and lights were upgraded, and a security patrol was established to ensure the safety of the marina and its members. The trust began hosting regular open meetings, where finances were shared transparently, and residents were encouraged to voice concerns. A level of openness that felt almost revolutionary compared to the secrecy of Karen's old regime. For the first time, people began to envision a future where the lake wasn't a battleground, but a sanctuary. A place of joy and community rather than fear and control. But even as progress blossomed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't seen the last of Karen. Her court date loomed, and though the charges against her were serious, I knew she was the kind of person who would use every opportunity to paint herself as a victim, to spin a new narrative, and to claw back any scrap of influence she could. Sure enough, reports surfaced that she was sending letters from her lawyer's office, claiming she had been unjustly persecuted, begging for sympathy from anyone who would listen, and even hinting at lawsuits she intended to file once she was vindicated. Most people ignored her. Some openly mocked her. But I couldn't help but wonder if she would find a way to cause one final eruption before fading into irrelevance. The answer came sooner than I expected. On the eve of her court appearance, Karen managed to post bail and return home temporarily. And rather than lying low as anyone else might have, she went on a tirade calling local reporters, staging interviews on her front lawn, and ranting about how she had been the victim of a vast conspiracy involving the county, the sheriff's office, and even me personally. Her words were so wild and incoherent that most media outlets declined to air them. But clips circulated online, and once again the neighborhood found itself the subject of ridicule, with outsiders gawking at the spectacle of a fallen HOA tyrant unraveling before the cameras. For residents who had once feared her, it was almost cathartic to see her reduced to a punchline, but for me, it was also a reminder that even in her weakest moments, still, the tide of history was against her, And as her court date dawned, the community gathered its resolve. Residents submitted victim impact statements describing the damage and fear she had caused. Photos of the vandalism and sabotage were presented as evidence, and deputies testified about her repeated confrontations and disorderly behavior. Karen, true to form, tried to turn the proceedings into theater, interrupting the judge, accusing witnesses of lying, and insisting she was the rightful leader of the HOA. But the more she ranted, the more she sealed her own fate. The judge, visibly exasperated, ultimately ordered her to undergo a psychological evaluation in addition to facing her charges. A decision that underscored what many had long suspected, that her obsession had tipped into genuine instability. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Not because the fight was over, but because for the first time it felt like justice was finally catching up with her. The community was no longer divided. The trust was stronger than ever. And even those who had once defended Karen now acknowledged the damage she had caused. And yet, as I stood once again on the dock that evening, watching the sunset cast gold across the lake, I knew that the final chapter had yet to be written. Because Karen's story, tragic, destructive, and dramatic as it was, still had one last act. And it would be up to us to ensure that it ended once and for all. The final act of Karen's downfall came with a strange mix of inevitability and shock. Because though everyone believed she had burned through her last shred of credibility after the court-awarded evaluation, she still managed to find one more way to throw the community into turmoil before her story closed for good. It began quietly, with rumors that she had been spotted late at night near the Marina again, despite the restraining order, wandering along the edge of the water as though she was staking some kind of invisible claim. And though deputies were called, by the time they arrived, she had vanished. People grew nervous again, parents keeping children closer, boat owners double-checking locks and alarms, because even with her reputation in ruins, there was always the chance she might lash out in a final act of desperation. That chance came one stormy night when alarms went off at the Marina and neighbors rushed to find Karen waiting knee-deep in the shallows, trying to set fire to a storage shed with gasoline and matches, her face streaked with rain and tears as she screamed incoherently about taking back what was hers. Deputies arrived just in time to stop the blaze from spreading, dragging her out of the water as she kicked and cursed, and this time there was no bail, no delay. No reprieve. The charges were upgraded to arson and endangerment, and she was taken directly into custody. The community, rattled but relieved, knew that at last she had crossed the line so completely that even her most sympathetic defenders could no longer stand by her. And though the Marina smelled faintly of smoke for days, there was also a fresh sense of safety, the kind that comes only after a storm finally breaks. In the weeks that followed, life around the lake shifted noticeably, as though a weight had been lifted off everyone's shoulders. Where there had once been constant tension and division, there was now laughter and chatter. Families returned to the docks without fear. Children splashed in the shallows, and weekend gatherings grew larger than ever before. United by a shared relief that the tyranny of the HOA was truly over, the trust flourished, finalizing contracts with local vendors, expanding amenities, and even setting aside a portion of revenue for community projects like park benches, walking trails, and a new playground. What had once been the site of bitter feuds became a model of cooperation, and I often found myself pausing in the middle of a busy day at the Marina, marveling at how quickly healing had taken root once Karen's shadow was gone. Yet, even in her absence, her name remained etched into the history of the neighborhood, not as the leader she had once pretended to be, but as the cautionary tale everyone now told to warn against unchecked control and obsessive pride. Her trial was swift, the evidence overwhelming. And though she attempted one last time to paint herself as a victim of conspiracies, the jury saw through her theatrics and delivered a guilty verdict on multiple charges. The sentence was firm: several years in prison along with mandatory counseling, and while some whispered that it was a sad end for someone who had once wielded so much power, most agreed it was the only fitting consequence for the chaos she had inflicted. Watching the news coverage of her being led away to serve her sentence, I felt a profound sense of closure, not triumph. Because there was no victory in seeing a neighbor's life implode, only a reminder of how dangerous unchecked ambition and obsession could be. The community didn't celebrate her downfall. Instead, we quietly focused on what we had built together in her absence, determined never to let such power fall into one person's hands again. Over time, Karen became little more than a ghost story, her old house falling into disrepair until eventually it was sold to a young couple who wanted nothing to do with HOA, politics, and everything to do with enjoying the peace of the lake. The graffiti faded, the docks shone under new paint, and the marina now bustling with families. Fishermen and boaters stood as a symbol of resilience. On the one-year anniversary of the Trust's founding, we held a community celebration at the marina, complete with food, music, and fireworks over the water. And as I looked around at the smiling faces, I realized we hadn't just reclaimed the lake, we had reclaimed our sense of community, our right to enjoy the place we called home without fear of harassment or control. That night, as the fireworks reflected in the lake's gentle ripples, people told stories of the battles we had fought, laughing now at the absurdity of it all. And though Karen's name came up often, it no longer carried fire, it carried lessons, the kind that would outlive any one person's vendetta. For me personally, the journey was transformative. I had started out simply wanting to launch my boat on my own lake. An act so small and ordinary, it should never have sparked conflict. And yet that single spark had ignited a war that exposed the flaws of an entire system and reshaped the community forever. I never wanted to be a leader, but I had been forced into that role by necessity, and in the end, I discovered that leadership wasn't about power or control, it was about responsibility, transparency, and the willingness to stand up when no one else would. The Marina Trust wasn't mine alone. It belonged to everyone who had fought alongside me, everyone who had stood up to intimidation and refused to back down. And I knew that as long as we held on to that spirit, no HOA or tyrant could ever take it from us again. Looking back now, it's almost hard to believe how far we came, how close we came to losing everything, and how much stronger we emerged because of it. Karen may have tried to burn the lake, but instead, you ended up forging a community out of fire, a community that learned resilience, solidarity, and the value of shared ownership. Standing on the dock at sunset, the water stretching out like glass before me, I felt a deep gratitude, not for the battles we had fought, but for the peace we had earned. And as I watched boats drift lazily back into their slips, laughter echoing across the water, I knew that no matter what storms came our way in the future, we would face them together, stronger than ever before. Because in the end, the story wasn't about Karen's downfall. It was about our rise. It's about how a lake once torn apart by control had become a sanctuary of freedom and unity. And that, I realized, was the true victory, the one that would last long after Karen's name was forgotten. If you followed this story from beginning to end, then you know it's more than just neighborhood drama. It's a reminder of what happens when ordinary people refuse to be silenced, when they stand up against unfair control, and when they fight for their right to live freely. Stories like this remind us that no matter how overwhelming the odds seem, change is possible, and communities can rise stronger after even the fiercest storms. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories of resilience, justice, and unexpected victories, make sure you subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel, because the next story might just inspire you in ways you never imagined.